of isolation and loneliness on ourselves and our health. And so I'm really grateful that you are with us today to talk to the Facebook audience about this critical issue.
Oh, thank you. I'm grateful to have this opportunity to potentially help in any small way that I can. I recognize how many people are currently struggling, and it's so important to realize we're not alone.
That's right. So loneliness is something that a lot of people struggle with all the time, right? I mean, this is not only about the coronavirus, but certainly this period of real social isolation where people are sheltering at home. People who are all alone are all alone. People have much smaller social networks. Um, has made loneliness a topic that touches even more people. And I've heard already from so many people that this pandemic has stirred up these similar feelings. So I'm excited to ask you questions. We're going to try to see if some questions came in off Facebook that we can ask you as well. But thank you for bringing your expertise to our audience. So, COVID-19 has put the problems of social isolation and loneliness front and center in really almost everyone's lives. But you've been working in this space for a very long time. How prevalent was loneliness as a broad social concern before this?
Yeah, it's really been something that is already affecting a significant portion of the population. And so while we don't have exact prevalence rates, because this has been not routinely collected population wide, but among the national studies, for instance, some of even the most conservative estimates suggest that 1 in 5 adults is lonely. And this is not just the United States, this is something that is more global. And serious enough so that the UK has appointed a minister for loneliness. And published a national health strategy focused on loneliness. Other countries are also similarly concerned about the public health implications. For instance, I recently served on a committee for the National Academy of Sciences that recently issued a report just in February that identified social isolation and loneliness as a public health concern. And so this was a significant issue and concern for public health even before the COVID-19 crisis. And as you mentioned, this is something that now is coming to the forefront, where it's affecting everyone to some extent or another, whether it's directly or indirectly. And so there's important questions about how this is going to impact public health going forward.
When you think about kind of the baseline loneliness people feel, and then you think about the coronavirus, phase that we're in and loneliness, what are some of the most important things you've learned in your research before that you think are particularly important for us to all understand now?
Well, one of the things that is really important is that this is more than just a distressing feeling. This can affect more than just our emotional well-being or our psychological health, but that there are profound effects on our physical health, as well as cognitive health. My research has focused particularly on physical health and has helped to establish social isolation and loneliness as risk factors for premature mortality. So for instance, in one of my meta-analyses, what we found was that being lonely predicted earlier death by 26%, social isolation by 29%, and living alone by 32%. But conversely, we found that being socially connected increases our odds of survival by 50%. And so what this suggests is that this can have a profound effect on even our risk for mortality. And of course, other studies show the effects that this can have on other kinds of long-term health outcomes like chronic illness and biological processes that explain these effects.
So when you start to see these effects in the general population, what kind of evidence, like what happens to show the impact of these type of things? Like, how does someone know if they are at risk for this and what they can do about it?
Right. So, first of all, loneliness and isolation can affect anyone. They're, of any age, any walk of life, any demographic. This can affect us all. There are some identified risk factors. So, for instance, those who live alone are at increased risk. That doesn't mean that if you live alone that you're
Okay.
automatically lonely. Of course, you can have a wide social network and still live alone, but there is increased risk of that. Having poor quality relationships can also put one at increased risk. Having existing physical or mental health conditions can put people at increased risk. Um, Physical mobility and sensory impairments can put people at increased risk, as well as those who are members of stigmatized groups. And so it's important to recognize that while this can be something that is experienced universally, that some groups may be at greater risk than others.
So we've thought a lot, I think society has thought a lot, maybe not enough, but certainly there's the health mandate of everyone who can stay home and socially isolate, it's better from a health point of view. Now, not everyone can do that, and that obviously has a risk to those people, but people have been pretty clear on encouraging most people as much social distancing as possible. And we've thought a lot as a society about the economic implications of that, even though potentially not enough, because that hits different parts of the population with different, people who've saved up money for a rainy day like this. A lot of people can't possibly save up enough money, especially women of color, single family households, but a lot of people didn't have that ability. But we've thought about the economic impact. But I don't know if there's been as much thought about the social impact of that recommendation to socially isolate. Given everything Julianne, the mental costs, the health risks that can happen. Would you recommend people socially isolate? Is it worth it?
This is, I'm so glad you asked this question because, one of the things I want to be incredibly careful about is with all of the evidence and my research showing some of the health effects of being socially isolated and loneliness, I would hate for anyone to use this evidence as justification for not following these recommendations. And, and I can just say I've been working from home for the last 4 weeks. I'm practicing this myself. One of the things also to help contextualize why I'm saying this is that much of what we know about the health effects of social isolation and loneliness are chronic. And so, in fact, some of the evidence that I just mentioned, these studies followed people for an average of 7.5 years. These are chronic effects. The threat that we are facing currently with the current COVID-19 crisis is an immediate threat. And so we really do need to follow the recommendations of the CDC and other organizations. And, but I've certainly been sensitive to recognizing that despite that, there is some real distress that goes along with this, and that it may be incredibly challenging to navigate this. And as you said, people of different backgrounds and situations may not have the luxury to stay at home. They may be an essential worker, or they may not also. They may be struggling with income in the first place. And so we have to really be sensitive to different people's situations. and really think carefully about how we can potentially mitigate the effects so that what we hope is a relatively short-term crisis doesn't turn into longer-term additional public health concerns.
You know, it is interesting. My only experience studying this was after my husband died. Adam Grant and I wrote a book on option B on what happens after grief, after trauma of all kinds. And certainly loneliness and isolation is part of it. You feel very alone and you feel very separate from people. And one of the things we studied and recommended is kicking the elephant out of the room. That, you have these isolated incidents where you go through something where, no one wants to say, like, how are you? Because your husband just died, so no one says anything to you at all. And I wrote about that. This is different in the sense that there's almost no one who's going through this that's going through it alone. And I don't think anyone's embarrassed to say or doesn't know how to say, are you feeling lonely? Are you feeling lonely? Like, it's part of the dialogue. Yet I still think there's an elephant to kick out of the room because there's such a strong public health mandate to do this. I think people probably are worried about admitting, okay, I'm following this, but this is really hard for me. So we recommended when people have loss that you don't ignore it, that you say to them, I'm here if you want to talk. How are you today? That you acknowledge. What's your recommendation for how we acknowledge and get people to talk about, I am feeling lonely. I realize I'm lucky. I realize I'm not sick. I realize I'm getting to stay home because I'm not an essential worker, but I'm still really lonely and that's real. How do we kick that elephant out of the room? What would you recommend people say to one another?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think it's important to acknowledge to yourself that this distress is normal. This is your body signaling that you need to reconnect. Scientists from a variety of disciplines have argued that we are social beings and that we need others for survival, and that our brains have adapted such that that we expect others around. And in fact, some have argued that loneliness is a biological drive like hunger or thirst. And so just like feeling hungry is this motive to reconnect, or sorry, just like hunger is a motive to seek out food, and thirst is this motive to seek out water, that loneliness is this motive to reconnect. And in fact, there's some really great recent research out of MIT that shows that 10 hours of isolation shows a similar neuro signature as 10 hours of going without food. And so we feel this social craving. And there's biological manifestations of this social craving, right? So I think first acknowledging that this is normal. There's not something wrong with you, right? And then really thinking of ways that we can help mitigate this distress. And one of the things that you point out is reaching out to others. In our research, we have found that providing emotional support to others can not only help them, but help ourselves as well. And there's so many other ways, of course, that we can think about this, but and the research has suggested, but I think the first step in this is recognizing that there's not something wrong with us, that this is a normal feeling.
And what tips do you have? So how do we feel less lonely and remain socially connected even while physically distant? I have some thoughts of things we've been trying in my home. I'd love to hear. Obviously, you're the expert. What are you recommending and what are you doing? And then I'll maybe share the same.
Yeah, so of course, one of the things I want to acknowledge right up front is that much of this comes from evidence about what we know about social isolation and loneliness under normal circumstances. And so this is a very different situation, but I think a lot of this may apply here. And so first of all, is a lot of what the evidence shows is that connecting in person has such an important effect. And so for those of us who are staying at home with others, making sure that that time together is quality time, and quality is important. But also, there's still ways that we can connect with others in a safe way. So, for instance, just yesterday, I was out on my driveway talking to my next door neighbor who was on his porch. And so we can connect. We've seen in cities where people are able to talk to their neighbors, over balconies. So we can still have those kinds of face-to-face kinds of connections. But we can also reach out to those who aren't close by, family, friends, people
Yeah.
in all areas of the world. We can pick up the phone, we can send a text, we can have a video chat. I was fortunate enough to have a video chat with our dear friends in Italy. And I'm sure you've probably had opportunities to connect to those that you love at a distance as well.
One of the
And
things,
so,
no, go ahead. Problems of being on the internet. Go.
yeah, I mean, I think this points out that, these are awesome, incredible tools, but sometimes things can get a bit disjointed. But that's one of the things that we can do is be flexible in these circumstances. And so, research has also suggested that how we focus our mindset can have an important effect as well, from how we appraise the situation or interpret the situation. So instead of thinking of this as I'm trapped at home, think of this as I'm doing this to protect the ones that I love. There's also ways that we can mitigate some of the distressing feelings of loneliness, uh, even if we are alone. So, for instance, mindfulness based meditation has been shown to help reduce some of these effects. Creative
I'm
expression.
laughing because it's my New Year's resolution every year to meditate, and this year too, and I just haven't done it at all. So I'm going to give other recommendations. Go ahead.
Yeah, so that's one thing you can do. Creative expression. We've seen, people singing in Italy, right? I don't know if I know you're working from home. Maybe your children have done other kinds of creative ways. I know my son's teaching himself how to play piano during our little time at home. Um, but research has suggested that creative expression, whether it's music or cooking or writing, any of these kinds of things can help mitigate that. But also, expressions of gratitude. One of the things that I have been so impressed with is seeing the images of people cheering for healthcare workers, this coming together. And research suggests that expressions of gratitude not only increase social bonding, but help reduce feelings of loneliness. And I'm sure in your work, you've seen examples of each of these things.
So one of the things I've been telling my children, so my kids are young, and this will segue into the next question we got actually from the audience. My kids are, teenagers, and, my fiance's kids, we've got 5 kids at home, 4 of which are teenagers. And, social connection is so important to them, and it is very much in person. I mean, I think people think teenagers are always on their phone, and they are, but they're also hanging out a lot. And so they're really missing that social connection. One of the things we've been talking about is when you feel lonely, reach out to someone else you think might be even lonelier. My parents are in Florida by themselves. My mother in law is in Minneapolis by herself. Call your grandparents, FaceTime your grandparents, because when you reach out to them, you will feel better yourself. One of the things that Adam and I really researched and really was a tenet of our work in helping people through grief and loneliness post death is exactly what you said. It is about finding the good, finding the gratitude. Yes, I'm home, but I'm not sick. Yes, I'm sick, but it's going okay. I mean, in every situation, including in death, we can find things actually to be grateful for. At our dinner table at night, we've always done best and worst. We've now added best, worst, and silver lining of the quarantine. And that's been hard. There's been a death in our family, a very close person in our family, my fiance's cousin. So we are not a family that is unscathed by this. It's hit us very directly. Yet, even in the face of that, we can teach our children to find something that's better in this situation as part of bridging to get through it. So that leads me to one of the questions we got. I have a question from the audience. Preteens and teens who are used to being very busy and social, what are your recommendations specifically for our children and the loneliness they might be experiencing?
So this hits close to home because I have a 13 and a 17-year-old. And so this is something that, I think about all the time. And one of the things that I am very conscious about is asking my children how they're feeling. And so being open with your kids about how they're feeling can be really important. Some kids are more open than others about expressing their emotions, and sometimes these things come out in other ways. And so they may not directly say, "Hey, I'm feeling lonely,"
Right.
but rather might
Yeah.
yeah. And so really having a space where that can be open, but also encouraging ways that they can still connect to their friends, still connect to their grandparents like you're doing, right? And so, for instance, every night when I'm making dinner, we do a video chat with my parents, and my kids are able to talk to their grandparents. But this is something that, of course, is challenging, and we're still trying to navigate. But I think it's really important, and it's an important question because even prior to this current situation, some surveys suggest that it's Gen Z that has the highest prevalence rates of loneliness. And so this is a real concern among this age group.
And a real challenge. Okay, another question from our audience. Some people don't want to admit they're lonely. How do you help someone who won't admit it?
So I think there is, I shouldn't say I think, we have evidence that there is stigma associated with loneliness.
And do you think
Many
that's true even now saying, look, I'm lonely? Because now it should be much easier. Do you think it's easier?
I hope some of the stigma is taking away from that, and of course, scientists are currently trying to gather evidence on this to really look at what kinds of things may be changing according to our current situation. But one of the ways that I try to help reduce the stigma around this is acknowledging that all of us need to be socially connected. And in fact, the evidence suggests that it is on a continuum. It's not any kind of threshold effect. In fact, I often get the question, how many friends do you need for a health benefit? As if there's, this threshold effect.
Right.
And below it, you're in big trouble. And as long as you're above it, you're fine.
Like it's a step function, in or out, which of course it's not.
Right. And instead, we're actually all somewhere on the continuum. And the evidence supports this. In fact, it shows a dose response effect. For every increase in social connection, there's a decrease in risk. And so if instead we think of this as part of a healthy lifestyle, that we all need to be socially connected, and that we're all somewhere on that continuum, it helps reduce that stigma, because just like we all need to be physically active, we're all kind of somewhere in having some kind of mixed success at that. And we could all do a little bit better. And so I think it allows us to think about how we can each improve in our own lives, and that it's something that applies to us all.
And then I wonder if, again, trying to look for the silver lining, which is psychologically healthy way to get through things that are tough, is I wonder if on the other side we have just so much greater appreciation for human contact. I was saying to someone today, you know, when I lost my husband, Dave, I never really appreciated my birthdays before that as I got older. I felt like, oh my God, I'm growing old. But once I lost him, I realized birthdays don't always happen and I've appreciated every one. Think about the last time you went to a restaurant. How grateful were you? Think about the next time you go to a restaurant or the last time you hugged a friend. How grateful were we? I'd like to think I'm a pretty grateful person, but I don't believe I was like, oh my God, I just hugged a friend. And on the other side of this, when we are able to do that, I think we will have that just deeper appreciation. And I wonder if people will feel less lonely because our expectations for social contact, I don't know if it'll remain, but we've gone through this period of so much less that we'll be able to find ways to connect more easily. That'll be my last question. Is that possible that this resets our abilities in some way? Or is that too much of a stretch?
I'm an optimist, and I certainly relate to everything you've just said. I nearly lost my husband to cancer a few years ago, and similarly, recognize that birthdays are a privilege that not everyone gets, and one of the things that I hope comes from this otherwise awful situation is a greater appreciation for our relationships, a greater appreciation for the simple things in life,
Yeah.
and that we can learn and grow and become stronger from this.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I am so grateful that you got on here and shared your wisdom. Thank you for the research you've done in this for so many years, because it's moments like this where that deep expertise matters. And I guess for everyone out there, both of us, I'll speak for both of us, Julianne, we wish that everyone finds the connection, finds the strength to get through this, faces the feelings we're having, including loneliness, and supports each other all the way through. It's what we do at Facebook. What we try to do is build tools that enable that, but there's so many different ways to do it. And we hope people find that connection to others they need. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.